Night of the UFOs. Chapter 1. The morning sun crept above the hazy horizon, casting its relentless heat over the Brazilian countryside. 10-year-old Francisco awoke to the dry, oppressive air seeping through the cracked plaster walls of his family's small home. As he rolled out of bed, the rooster's cry broke the sleepy stillness that hung over the remote village of Santa Isabel like a smothering blanket. Francisco quickly pulled on his clothes, a faded yellow shirt and worn leather sandals, then headed outside to begin his daily chores before the sun got too high. He breathed in the earthy aromas of the surrounding farmlands that his family now called home after moving from the crowded city last year. Francisco still missed the energy and bustle of urban life, but the wide-open freedom of the countryside had its own appeal for a curious young adventurer. After feeding the clucking chickens and milking the cow, Francisco ate a quick breakfast of bread, cheese, and café con leche. He promised his mother Maria he would return before midday, then headed out to explore with the endless summer day stretched out before him. As Francisco wandered down the dusty road out of town, he watched small lizards skitter and hide among the scrub brush lining the path. The shrill buzz of cicadas pulsed like an endless siren, warning of the scorching heat to come. Away from the shade of trees, the sun beat down as if focused through a magnifying glass. It bleached the landscape in hues of yellow and white, broken only by glimpses of green from succulent plants able to survive the arid climate. Francisco aimlessly followed the road as it wound among spiny, cactus-covered hills toward the edge of town. He soon approached a large, murky reservoir that provided the village's water supply. Santa Isabel relied on the rains to fill the man-made basin, but drought had left it lower than usual for this time of year. Francisco gazed at the still, brownish-green water reflecting the cloudless sky. Pelicans glided low over the surface looking for fish, while blackbirds perched on the muddy banks calling raucously. He recalled his mother's stern warning to stay away from the reservoir, where hidden dangers lurked beneath the shallow water. Yet it beckoned Francisco closer with the promise of adventure for a young boy thirsty for excitement. As Francisco crept down the embankment toward the water, he scanned for signs of movement under the shade of trailing vines and tall grasses. Perhaps a deadly coral snake slithering through the underbrush, or a 6-foot-long caiman, a smaller cousin of the crocodile, awaiting unseen near the shoreline. Francisco had also heard terrifying tales of murderers dumping bodies in the reservoir, knowing the scavengers and muddy bottom would quickly dispose of any evidence. Just thinking about what grisly secrets this ominous body of water must hold both frightened and thrilled Francisco. He imagined himself a brave explorer on the verge of an incredible discovery. Francisco pretended not to notice the watchdog glare of the sun high overhead, signaling that he had already stayed out longer than permitted. Slowly and silently, Francisco skirted the water's edge, avoiding the beaded leaves of mata plants he recognized from past painful encounters. Their harmless appearance hid a toxic red sap that stung like acid. As Francisco lost himself in the adventure, he stumbled on a partially buried metal tin. Clearing away the dirt, he pried open the rusty container to reveal a leather pouch inside. Francisco's heart quickened as he untied the rotting cords and pulled out a delicate gold bracelet engraved with ornate details. It must have been carefully hidden here long ago, but by whom? Tempted to pocket his newfound treasure, Francisco finally decided to show his mother in hopes of returning it to its rightful owner. With the gold bracelet safely tucked in his pocket, Francisco continued his cautious trek along the shore where mud socked at his sandals. In the distance, a formation of Marines flew in tight formation over the jungle canopy on some mysterious mission. Francisco waved enthusiastically despite having no idea if the pilots could even see him down below. He daydreamed of one day joining the Marines and soaring above the earth, untethered by gravity. Eventually, the roar of engines faded, leaving Francisco once again alone with the primal sounds of nature. The screech of wild toucans and macaws, the low bellow of a howler monkey echoed from the trees. Dragonflies with electric blue bodies darted over the water, stopping occasionally to lay eggs below the surface. Francisco crouched low to watch a line of leafcutter ants transporting tiny fragments back to their colony, oblivious to the giant boy observing their work. Francisco was enthralled by each tiny miracle of life the untamed landscape revealed. He imagined no adventure could be more exciting than the natural wonders that surrounded him every day. Suddenly, a large, dark mass just below the water's edge caught Francisco's eye, jolting him back to the present. His breath caught in his throat as he made out the shape of a human body crumpled face down among the trailing vines. Gripped by equal parts fear and curiosity, Francisco crept slowly toward the still form obstructed by the foliage. As he gingerly pulled back the curtain of vines, Francisco gasped at the nightmarish sight now exposed. He instantly recognized it as a corpse in advanced stages of decay, half submerged along the shoreline. Fighting the urge to vomit, Francisco studied the gruesome details with morbid fascination. The man's expensive black suit, now shredded and filthy, clung to a bloated frame. The waterlogged flesh had turned an eerie pale gray mottled by dark ruptures. Parts of the arms and legs showed ragged bite marks where aquatic scavengers had already begun feasting. The eyes were missing entirely, with insects swarming in and out of the hollow sockets. Francisco noted one detail amid the horror: a gold watch, encrusted with gems glinting on the man's wrist, its hands frozen forever at 10:35. Bracing himself against the overpowering stench, Francisco leaned closer to examine what he could of the man's features. A gaping concave wound was visible on the back of the skull, as if it had been brutally smashed by a heavy rock or metal pipe. The level of violence implied by such an injury made Francisco dizzy with fear. What kind of fiend could have done this? Were they still lurking nearby? Despite his pounding heart, Francisco felt compelled to uncover more about this man's identity and how he had met such a terrible fate. He hesitantly reached out a hand to shift the body's position, instantly recoiling when his fingertips made contact with the mushy, clammy flesh riddled with squirming maggots. The reality of the situation suddenly came crashing down on Francisco. He was just a child, alone and unequipped to handle the gravity of this gruesome discovery. Francisco knew he had to distance himself immediately and tell someone who could properly take over. As he backed away on trembling legs, Francisco notices a leather wallet sticking out of the corpse's jacket pocket. Before he could think twice, Francisco grabbed the soddy wallet and quickly retreated from the shoreline. The image of the man's gelatinous, eyeless face seemed to follow Francisco as he scrambled up the embankment in shock. He wanted to run and keep running until he reached home, but his legs felt heavy and detached from his panicked mind. Glancing down at the wallet clasped in his shaking hand, Francisco knew he at least had to try and identify the victim before reporting him. Ducking behind a large rock to hide from any potential passerby, Francisco gingerly opened the sopping wet wallet. He found a water-logged ID card identifying the man as Alan Pierce, 37 years old, from Rio de Janeiro. Relieved to finally put a name to the gruesome remains, Francisco carefully returned the wallet and ID to his pocket. He realized this evidence could help authorities find Alan's family and give him a proper burial. Bolting upright, Francisco resumed his adrenaline-fueled run all the way back into town, his sandals kicking up clouds of scorching red dirt. The hills of Santa Isabel had never seemed so far away. Francisco fixed his eyes on the distant rooftops, using them like a beacon to guide him home. Francisco headed directly to the small general store, shouting for Dona Maria, the owner. Kindly Dona Maria had become like a second mother to Francisco since his family arrived in Santa Isabel. Francisco knew he could trust her to know what to do next. He breathlessly described the events of the morning, his exploration by the reservoir, the finding of the ornate bracelet, and the horrific discovery of Alan's body. Dona Maria's weathered face paled as she made the sign of the cross. She promised Francisco she would call the police straight away. "You've done well, child, though I regret you had to see such evil at your young age," Dona Maria sighed, squeezing Francisco's shoulder gently. "His wallet said he was from Rio de Janeiro. Why do you think he ended up here?" Francisco asked nervously, still catching his breath. Dona Maria's expression darkened further. "I pray we do not find others like him in those waters. Now go. Get yourself home before any more trouble finds you today." Francisco nodded, handing over the soggy wallet containing Alan's ID. Dona Maria ruffled Francisco's dark hair affectionately before picking up the phone to alert the authorities. As Francisco walked home on exhausted legs, he felt the world shifting beneath his feet. Like passing through some invisible threshold, he sensed his innocence sinking into the red dirt with each step. He wished his carefree adventure that morning had ended with simply finding a golden bracelet. But Francisco now understood true evil existed much closer than the far-off city streets his mother always warned of. Darkness lurked in the familiar reservoir he had explored since arriving here. And it lived in the hearts of men who could savagely take a life, for reasons Francisco could not yet grasp. He quickened his pace as the sun dipped low in the sky, wanting desperately to leave this day behind. But deep down Francisco knew, even tucked safely in bed tonight, the horrors he witnessed would haunt his dreams. Chapter 2. On the day following Francisco's disturbing discovery, an air of unease settled over the remote village of Santa Isabel like an oppressive fog. Word spread quickly about the gruesome corpse the young boy had stumbled upon down by the reservoir. For a tight-knit community unaccustomed to such dark excitement, this news became the talk of the town. Under the blazing morning sun, small groups gathered in the village square and beside the cantina, speaking in hushed yet eager tones about Francisco's experience. They swapped hearsay and wild speculation about the victim's identity and how he met his horrific fate. The men shook their heads gravely while glancing about for any new gossip. The women crossed themselves and muttered prayers for protection from evil. Among the murmuring crowds, a palpable current of macabre curiosity began to build. Francisco had become an overnight celebrity for his chilling encounter. Some villagers called him brave, while others labeled the boy foolish to go anywhere near the cursed reservoir. Francisco hid from the unwanted limelight at home, cloistered safely indoors by his fretful parents. But his mind continued to replay everything he had seen by the water in vivid detail, the expensive watch glinting on the corpse's swollen wrist, the strange surgical scars, the empty, ravaged eye sockets. Francisco tossed and turned all night, pursued by nightmares filled with shapeless terrors. As the day wore on, restless boredom took hold of Santa Isabel. Finally, a group of the village's most daring men decided to head down to the reservoir themselves and see if the extraordinary rumors held any truth. Within minutes, nearly half the town's meager population joined the grim procession, driven by macabre curiosity. Only the very devout and superstitious stayed behind, making signs against evil and wanting no part in temptation. The ragtag assembly of villagers made their way along the dusty path leading out toward the reservoir, swatting at flies as the midday sun beat down mercilessly. The group maintained a reverent silence, broken only by occasional whispers and nervous speculations about what lay in store. Many secretly hoped the police had already come and gone, leaving the scene accessible for prying eyes. When the reservoir finally appeared through the shimmering heat, the crowd slowed its pace, hanging back warily. Police tape and official vehicles blocked the shoreline ahead. Stern officers stood guard, preventing onlookers from gaining access to the water's edge. Loud complaints and protests rose from the crowd as villagers craned their necks, trying fruitlessly to catch a glimpse of the notorious body. The officers' threats and intimidation could not deter the most stubborn and defiant among them. But eventually even these holdouts realized there would be no satisfying their dark cravings today, and slowly dispersed. Down by the water, the police chief briefed two newly arrived investigators from the city on the situation, handing over Francisco's statement. Dressed in crisp black suits despite the oppressive heat, the men had an air of calm, detached authority about them. They surveyed the scene methodically while the rural police hovered nearby, awed and intimidated by these big city officials. One investigator, who introduced himself as Officer Costa, opened a large leather satchel filled with forensic examination tools. He pulled on latex gloves and a surgical mask before approaching the bloated, mud-caked corpse. Costa crouched beside the body slowly, as if expecting it to suddenly move despite its obvious decayed state. Up close, the foul yet faded smell of putrefaction clung to the remains, suggesting a lengthy period of exposure to the elements. Costa noted the grayish, almost luminescent pallor of the skin and the unnatural tightness of flesh across the skull. He observed no decomposition or insect activity that should be present. With extreme care, Costa used a gloved hand to slowly shift the corpse and conduct a visual inspection of all sides, pausing occasionally to take close-up photographs. The clothing appeared several decades old and in tatters, yet lacked any blood evidence or bullet damage. However, the victim's facial disfigurements told a sinister tale of prolonged, excruciating torture. Costa called the other investigator over to get his analysis of the bizarre surgical marks and mutilations covering the corpse. The man leaned down pensively for a closer look at the haphazard scar-like patterns crisscrossing the bald skull. Costa pointed out the clean, bloodless removal of the eyes and tongue long before death occurred. Both men exchanged troubled glances, seemingly at a loss to explain what they were witnessing. After thoroughly photo-documenting the remains from all angles, the investigators signaled for the body bag to be brought down. Once the corpse was safely contained and transferred to the medical examiner's vehicle, Costa rode along to personally oversee the high-priority autopsy back in the capital. The strange case had clearly rattled even these veteran city officials. Meanwhile, the remaining investigator directed the rural police to begin searching the surrounding shoreline for any buried evidence. But their extensive excavation of the mud and silt proved fruitless, leaving the victim's identity still shrouded in mystery. As the day wore on, any lingering crowd members still hoping for a dramatic revelation eventually trickled away unsatisfied. With the grim spectacle now concluded, the villagers returned to their daily routines, which suddenly seemed dull compared to the macabre drama. Only young Francisco remained transfixed, haunted by what he had witnessed in a place that once held such wonder and promise for adventure. Now the reservoir embodied tangible evil, hiding untold horrors beneath its placid facade. That evening, as Francisco picked at his dinner, he recalled the investigator named Costa leaning over the corpse, scrutinizing those eerie surgical cuts with forensic fascination. Costa's hushed, tense exchanges with his colleague hinted at unsettling theories about the victim's disfigurements that defied logic. What were they keeping secret out of earshot of the rural police, Did they truly have any idea what sadistic evil had mutilated that man so terribly before dumping his body to quietly rot? And why did it seem they were more interested in retrieving the corpse quickly than identifying the perpetrator? Francisco's parents noticed his lack of appetite and hollow expression. "You must try to forget all this ugliness," his mother urged, squeezing Francisco's hand. But the images from the reservoir had etched themselves too deeply already into his young mind. That night, Francisco tossed and turned as the same vision looped relentlessly, the empty black sockets of the corpse seeming to stare directly at him, pleading for answers he did not have. In the small church the next day, the local priest addressed the shaken community, preaching about evil hid in the shadows and demon possession. But his impassioned words rang hollow to Francisco, offering no real protection from the true darkness he had glimpsed in the world outside this remote village. As worshippers filed out into the blinding sunlight, Francisco lingered in the cool, quiet sanctuary, saying a silent prayer for the unknown victim by the reservoir. He prayed the authorities might find justice and closure for the man, though he knew such horrific desecration could never be made right. Francisco stayed kneeling in the pew long after the church emptied, reluctant to rejoin a village that now felt tainted by things seen and unseen. With a heavy heart, he finally turned and pushed open the weathered wooden doors. Stepping into the harsh white light outside, Francisco let the doors swing shut behind him on this small moment of refuge. He knew he must find his own way to process the darkness within that no prayer could fully cleanse. Chapter 3. That evening, a tense silence hung over the dinner table in Francisco's small home like an ominous cloud. The only sounds were the gentle clinking of cutlery on plates as his mother prepared their modest meal, and his father's slow pacing footsteps echoing off the cracked plaster walls. When the meal was finally laid out, Francisco simply stared down at his bowl of beans and rice without touching it. The savory aromas that usually made his mouth water now turned his stomach. He kept replaying the horrific images from the reservoir over and over, the discolored, swollen flesh, the hollow black eye sockets, the strange surgical scars carved into the waxy skin. Francisco shuddered and wrapped his arms tight around himself, as if he could squeeze the visions from his mind. His parents exchanged worried looks across the table. Francisco barely registered their presence, lost in the living nightmare of memories. "You need to eat, son," his mother urged gently. But Francisco just shook his head, not looking up. The silence stretched on, broken only by the scrape of utensils and his father's heavy footsteps moving around the cramped dining room. Francisco's gaze stayed locked on the rough grain of the wooden table, until suddenly his father's calloused hand gripped his shoulder firmly. Francisco flinched. "I'm sorry, my boy," his father said in a grave tone. "But for the good of our family, you must tell me everything you can recall about that body." Francisco recoiled from his touch. "No, I want to forget it," he pleaded, his small voice echoing in the small room. His mother shot his father an angry look. "Can't you see you're upsetting the poor child?" she scolded, moving to embrace Francisco protectively. "He's been through enough horror already." But Francisco's father did not back down. His dark eyes bore intensely into his son. "I understand this is difficult," he implored, "but we must learn the truth. Our entire village could be in danger." Francisco peered up timidly, feeling torn. His father's stern expression held both grave concern and something more ominous Francisco couldn't identify. Swallowing hard, the boy started recounting details in a small, quivering voice. "The clothes were old and rotten, hard to make out," he murmured. "But strange white scars covered the arms, like someone had cut them." Francisco's mother glared angrily at her husband for pressing the issue, But Francisco continued slowly. The face was the worst part. No eyes, just black empty holes, and the smell. Francisco gagged reflexively at the memory. His mother pulled him against her chest, stroking his hair as he trembled. "There now, no more questions tonight," she said firmly, holding Francisco as if to shield him from his father's piercing stare. Over the following week, speculation ran rampant through the village about the identity of the mutilated corpse. When rumors surfaced that the remains likely belonged to Pablo Dominguez, a local fisherman, the news sent a fresh ripple of unease through the community. Reclusive Pablo had lived alone on the outskirts of town. Though he kept to himself, the villagers knew him as a familiar face around the docks and cantina. Trying to reconcile the grisly details from the reservoir with Pablo's mundane presence in their tiny village left a chilling incongruity in everyone's minds. At the market the next morning, Francisco overheard his father discussing the situation in hushed tones with the other vendors as they set up their stalls. "Who could have committed such diabolical evil against one of our own?" his father murmured, making the sign of the cross. The men just shook their heads grimly. One vendor named Marcelo voiced what many were surely thinking. "I never trusted that strange Pablo, always off alone on the water for days doing God knows what," he spat. "Maybe he was into devil worship or some other wickedness that brought this fate upon him." Francisco's father looked troubled by this, but did not argue. As Francisco arranged fruit displays, he puzzled over Marcelo's sinister theory. Could Pablo truly have been involved with dark forces or the occult? And did that somehow lead to his horrific death? A knot formed in Francisco's gut as the market bustled, the cheery energy feeling suddenly false and stifling. Over the following months, the unsolved mystery cast an unspoken shadow over the village. Though most residents returned to their daily routines, they now held each other a bit closer, wary of unnamed threats. For young Francisco, the vivid memories from the reservoir persisted like ghosts that haunted his dreams. He often woke in a cold sweat, his mind conjuring grisly new details that police had shielded him from. Francisco picked up on enough hushed conversations to grasp that powerful outside forces wanted certain truths buried with Pablo's body. This seeded Francisco's young mind with ominous theories about the true evil lurking in the shadows of his small community, threatening from somewhere just out of sight. His parents noticed Francisco's withdrawn jumpiness, but reasoned it would fade with time. They had no glimpse into the unspeakable visions still assailing their son's psyche. By day, Francisco struggled to focus on chores and playing with friends. But at night, the empty black eyes still found him without fail, gleaming with secrets the living were not meant to know. The years would eventually dull the horrific memories to a hazy nightmare. As an adult, Francisco came to see wisdom in some mysteries remaining unsolved, guarding fragile minds from knowledge too dark to fathom. But the simmering secrets surrounding Pablo's bizarre fate still called to Francisco from the reservoir's unfathomable depths. A darkness now lived inside him too, in places beyond childhood's reach. Chapter 4. Over the next 6 years, the 1980 ritualistic murder of Pablo Dominguez remained an unsolved cold case in the remote Brazilian village of Santa Isabel. As the urban detectives moved on to fresher crimes, the file on Pablo's bizarre mutilation and organ removal gathered dust, receiving only an occasional cursory review. With the reclusive victim having no vocal advocates demanding justice, the urgency surrounding his peculiar murder quickly faded. The police checked off procedural necessities, interviews with Pablo's cantina acquaintances that revealed little, searches of his sparse home, and boat that uncovered no evidence, analysis of DNA and fingerprints that ultimately went nowhere. But the overwhelmed city officials failed to recognize the obvious occult connections or anomalous rapid mummification of Pablo's corpse. To them, he was just another dumped body in a convenient spot. They did not connect the ritualistic details to the wave of similar phenomena occurring globally during those volatile decades. So, without eyewitnesses or suspects, the file on Pablo's savage murder gradually slipped into the cold case archives, an unsolved loose and relegated to a life of fading memories. In the ensuing years, young Francisco did his best to leave that trauma buried in the past where it belonged. Now a muscular 16-year-old, he worked dutifully on his family's struggling goat farm as the hazy memories from 1980 receded further each year. Francisco took long detours whenever possible to avoid the reservoir's haunted banks that still turned his stomach. Though the nightmares had ceased, contemplating the perverse ritualistic torture Pablo had endured gave Francisco chills. What demented beliefs could drive a person to such depravity? And what if more than one individual had been involved in the horrific ceremonial slaying? The implications made Francisco queasy. He busied himself with chores, trying not to imagine the sinister motivations behind such an act. While most residents had moved on, the 1982 discovery of another mutilated nude body in those accursed waters quickly ripped open old wounds for the rural community. Francisco's parents hid the news to protect their son from reliving past trauma. But around town, whispers brewed about a fledgling serial killer haunting the remote region. Others suggested occult rituals or illegal organ harvesting rings. No speculative cause for the violent desecrations was too far-fetched now. Francisco overheard the troubling theories being debated solemnly by his father and other elders. Their grave expressions conveyed a shared sense that greater evil was awakening in their vulnerable village. At a town gathering the following week, the police chief urged citizens to remain vigilant but avoid hysteria over an unsupported serial murderer. Francisco noted his father's scoff at this hollow advice. They all knew the police were simply overwhelmed. Later at home, Francisco finally confronted his parents over what they were hiding. They reluctantly revealed the unsettling new murder at the reservoir, warning Francisco not to go near that accursed place. But Francisco read the dread lurking behind their eyes. There was a darkness now reclaiming their remote sanctuary, poised to strike again. That night, as Francisco lay awake, ears straining against the silence, the winds seemed to carry haunting cries from the direction of the reservoir, shrieks almost human, but warped by some unearthly malice. Francisco squeezed his eyes shut and pulled the covers tight, praying for Dawn's protection. But he knew then this was not the work of any ordinary criminal. Something primal and savage had marked their village, and it would feed again. When a third mutilated body surfaced in the reservoir 2 years later, Francisco's prayers for peace seemed hopelessly naive. Whatever malevolent force was spreading its grasp over Santa Isabel would not be satisfied until it owned the shattered souls of all who lived there. Francisco knew then that he could no longer just stand by waiting for the police to solve an evil so primordial. As young as he was, Francisco understood on an intuitive level that this darkness demanded action. The time had come for ordinary people to reclaim their home from the encroaching threats that hid in society's peripheral vision, emerging only to feed before disappearing into shadow once more. Francisco knew his path lay ahead down the winding dirt paths toward that cursed reservoir harboring so many secrets. He could no longer avoid that place woven so tightly with his fate. The visions would haunt him no more. For Francisco now embraced his self-assigned role as guardian and protector, defending his home against those that did not belong, human or otherwise. The police could keep chasing temporal leads. But Francisco understood this battle required looking beyond flesh and blood to the spiritual decay corrupting Santa Isabel from within. And he would not rest until balance was restored to the land and people he loved, whatever sacrifices that fight demanded. With calm resolve, Francisco gazed out his window into the darkness and prepared himself for the trials ahead. Chapter 5. The year 1994 marked a dramatic shift in public awareness surrounding the bizarre 1980 ritual murder of Pablo Dominguez. Nearly 15 years after the Brazilian authorities buried the disturbing case in bureaucracy, explosive classified details were finally leaked to the media, igniting renewed intrigue nationwide. On an otherwise ordinary morning, 25-year-old Francisco was browsing the local village market when screaming tabloid headlines suddenly stopped him cold. Gruesome autopsy photos revealed in cold case butchering. Right there on the front page were chilling images of Pablo's mutilated corpse splayed across the exam table, conjuring up vivid traumatic memories for Francisco in an instant. His chest tightened as he found himself staring once more at that bloated, decayed body from his childhood nightmares, the waxy white flesh, gaping surgical holes, and hollow-eyed stare Francisco had desperately tried to forget. A wave of nausea gripped him. He tossed the paper aside and rushed from the crowded stalls, struggling to erase the disturbing visions seared again into his mind. While the graphic leaked photos caused quite a public stir, it was the revelations within the autopsy report itself that sent true shockwaves across Brazil. According to the chilling clinical analysis, Pablo's heart, lungs, liver, intestines, and other organs had been surgically extracted from his body prior to death, removed with meticulous precision through small holes bored into the bone and tissue. The report noted these extracted organs showed no natural disease or damage. They had simply been harvested like pristine specimens by some unnervingly skilled hand. Even more disturbingly, Pablo's right ear, left eye, and facial tissues were also excised through similar perfectly round voids, as if carved out by an automated tool of terrifying accuracy. No medical examiner had ever witnessed surgical disfigurements quite like these before on a corpse. The uncanny holes driven through organ walls and bone implied medical technology beyond even the most sophisticated capabilities at the time. The cold, methodical nature of the ritualized organ removal compelled many to question what manner of human could perform such clinical, yet clearly sadistic acts upon another living being. As speculation exploded, people grasped for any rationalization of who or what could have inflicted these robotic atrocities, while somehow keeping Pablo alive during the torturous procedures. Were foreign black market organ harvesters to blame? Was there an elite cabal with a taste for the taboo driving such methodical mutilation? The fact that such shocking revelations had been concealed from the public for over a decade fueled accusations of a high-level cover-up. Renewed calls came for a full investigation into the peculiar 1982 murder and other similar unsolved cases that now seemed potentially linked. In the remote village of Santa Isabel, Francisco cringed as he observed the sweeping national interest in the Pablo Dominguez case igniting once again like wildfire. Part of him wished the horrific details could have remained forever buried in the past where they belonged. But he also sensed the victim's spirit could never rest peacefully until the whole truth finally emerged. As media coverage exploded, Francisco noticed local officials exchanging knowing looks and guarded whispers whenever Pablo's name came up. He was determined to learn what secrets they dared not utter publicly. Francisco knew from experience the authorities could not be trusted with the full truth. But he hoped to finally solve this mystery and expose the real evil that had defiled poor Pablo's body and spirit. The time had come. At the cantina after dinner one night, Francisco decided to cautiously broach the topic with the owner, Ricardo, whom he had known since childhood. Nursing a beer, Francisco leaned in discreetly. "This craziness about Pablo's case has everyone on edge lately," he murmured. "What do you really think happened to him, Ricardo?" The old barman's eyes narrowed as he slowly wiped the counter. After a tense pause, he replied under his breath, "There are some things good Christian folk are better off not knowing, my boy. That poor soul is with God now." Francisco considered pressing further, but thought better of it for the time being. The man's caginess only increased his suspicions that villagers were complicit in keeping certain secrets buried. That night, as Francisco lay awake brooding, he recalled odd aspects of his childhood he had overlooked at the time: the furtive gatherings held at the cantina after hours, his father's obsession over ritualistic details of Pablo's corpse, the police's convenient incompetence. Francisco now doubted it was all coincidence. What were they hiding? Hazy memories from 1980 filtered back to him in a new light: a half-heard conversations, strange marks on his father's arms, the watchful stares when Francisco had mentioned the surgical mutilations on Pablo's body. A chilling picture was coming into focus. Francisco knew sleep would not come easy until he had sifted through the fragments of clues now falling into place. Outside his window, the winds picked up as if sensing his unrest. They carried the distant howls of creatures roaming the night, sounding almost human to Francisco's uneasy mind. He pulled the blanket tighter and reached for his bedside Bible, desperate for the comfort of words he once believed divine. But a nagging voice whispered that true evil hid closest to that which claimed light. And real monsters often wore familiar faces. Chapter 6. The shocking 1994 autopsy leaks regarding Pablo Dominguez emerged on the heels of another pivotal event that had galvanized public interest across Brazil: the wave of mass UFO sightings in 1992, remembered as the Night of the UFOs. For those old enough to vividly recall those events, no reminder was needed of the surreal spectacle that unfolded in the fall of 1992. Even in remote villages like Francisco's, locals of a certain age still recounted with awe the mesmerizing lights that danced across the sky that night in ways no conventional aircraft could replicate. Rumblings of fascination had begun brewing over 2 months before the infamous incident. Starting in August 1992, scattered sightings cropped up along the southern coastline describing spherical bright lights, performing physics-defying aerial maneuvers. Some claimed orbs of light made instant 90-degree turns and reversals at unbelievable speeds. Others reported massive triangular craft gliding smoothly and silently through the night sky. Authorities brushed it off as meteors, clouds, or classified experimental aircraft. But reports steadily multiplied, describing formations of glowing orbs capable of impossible velocities, zigzags, and hovering. When the governor of Paraná State himself claimed a bright orb paced his flight, interest exploded. Military radar stations tracked over 20 unidentified contacts, evading fighter jets with ease. Finally, on October 20th, 1992, UFO activity came to a head in an event seared into Brazil's memory. Sightings skyrocketed over cities like Rio, São Paulo, and Porto Alegre in a massive countrywide flap. Calls flooded police lines with nearly 2,000 frantic reports of flashing lights and alien craft swarming neighborhoods. Entire city blocks lost power as the triangular and disc-shaped objects soundlessly hovered overhead. Car engines died, and streetlights flickered oddly. One terrified suburban resident managed to capture chilling footage of a glowing oval-shaped metallic ship passing over his neighborhood. On radar, stunned operators tracked up to 50 unidentified contacts occupying Brazilian airspace at a time, moving with impossible speed and agility. Scrambled jet pilots visually confirmed a colossal disk circled by orange lights before it instantly accelerated off radar. After 5 hours of chaotic aerial dances, the UFOs seemed to vanish entirely by 2 a.m., leaving only stunned confusion and heated speculation in their wake. Had secret military tech, time travelers, or extraterrestrial visitors filled the skies that night? In Francisco's remote village, locals gathered outside gazing upward as orange lights flitted amongst the stars. The 16-year-old Francisco snuck out to climb onto his roof, seeing several bright objects blaze erratic trails before disappearing. The implications were obvious to all. Something extraordinary had brazenly announced its presence, defying conventional explanation. Yet the government still suspiciously claimed it was just an abnormal meteorite concentration. When the mutilation leaks emerged 2 years later, many jumped to connect the surgical murders to the UFO wave, hoping to finally explain the bizarre mysteries. Francisco was reluctant at first, now a rational adult dismissive of fanciful theories. But even he had to admit strange forces did seem to be converging. At the village cantina, Francisco decided to bring up the topic over evening drinks, probing for clues. "People seem pretty spooked over this craziness with the UFOs and now the Pablo case leaks," he casually remarked to the bartender Ricardo. "Almost makes you wonder if it's all connected somehow." Ricardo's eyes narrowed as he slowly wiped the counter. "I try not to dwell on such matters too much," he muttered. "But I remember my grandfather once telling me that when strange lights fill the sky, it means ill fortune for us below." The cryptic comment gave Francisco chills. He leaned in discreetly, lowering his voice. "Have you heard anyone in town mention links between those lights in '92 and what happened to Pablo?" Ricardo shook his head. "Some theories are best left to rest," he said in a tone that ended the conversation. Francisco sat back, realizing he would get no further tonight. But the bartender's guarded manner only increased his hunch that the villagers were hiding their own connections to the mysteries. Later at home, Francisco's thoughts turned to his own father's dark obsession with Pablo's mutilations back in 1980. Had it merely been morbid fascination with the macabre? Or something more sinister tied to those lights in the sky? Francisco searched his memories for any clues dismissed as a child. He recalled his father muttering about arrangements and cleansing rituals with other men late at night when they thought Francisco was asleep. And townspeople would watch the skies nervously for days after those meetings, as if fearful what their actions might soon summon. Francisco shivered despite the warm night, feeling he stood on the cusp of a terrifying revelation that part of him still resisted confronting directly. But he knew sleep would not come easy until he pieced together the fragments of the past, now revealing a chilling hidden picture. Outside his window, scattered nighttime lights bobbed mysteriously over the distant reservoir. Francisco pulled his blanket tight and prayed for the wisdom to navigate the darkness that surely lay ahead. Chapter 7. Under mounting public pressure, the Brazilian authorities had no choice but to reopen the investigation into Pablo Domingues' bizarre 1992 ritualistic murder. The peculiar cold case swiftly landed on the desk of Detective Alfonso Reyes, a seasoned federal agent renowned for cracking occult-tinged cases deemed too unconventional for regular police. Reyes eagerly sifted through the aging Domingues files, crime scene photos, cursory interviews, redacted autopsy reports, hoping to uncover clues about the impossible surgical precision involved. The initial small-town police investigation had offered few solid leads beyond routine conversations with townspeople who barely knew the quiet, reclusive victim. But the coroner's analysis stood out as a promising lead. It referenced advanced futuristic tools potentially used to seamlessly extract organs and minimize blood loss during extensive surgical procedures on the living victim. This strongly indicated a level of technology exceeding what any typical murderer would possess in 1992. Reyes researched Brazilian surgeons capable of such skillful organ removal without leaving a gory mess. But no doctors fit the profile, and none would risk their career on such illegal depravity just for profit. Widening his search, Reyes cross-referenced rural autopsy reports from around that era. Intriguingly, he discovered several cases of livestock from nearby farms exhibiting similar unusual surgical incisions and specific organ removal through clean small holes, as if precisely excised by an automated device. The uncanny wound similarity between the animal and human corpses went beyond coincidence for Reyes. Clearly, some entity was surgically extracting specific organs using advanced tools no typical doctor had access to. Yet, the original closed-minded examinations had dismissed the rash of cattle mutilations as wild animal attacks, failing to make the obvious connection to the human case. After noting the eerily clinical, bloodless organ extractions on both the leaked human and animal autopsy files, Reyes considered a disturbing but logical link. The human and cattle mutilations could potentially have been carried out by the very same advanced technological source. Reyes then recalled numerous UFO sightings reported in that same rural area and timeframe as the surgical mutilations. In fact, one famous local cattle mutilation exhibiting similar hallmarks had occurred just 50 miles from the reservoir dump site where Domings was later found, less than 2 months prior. As Reyes exhaustively cross-referenced the dates and locations, the perceived connections between the cattle mutilations, spikes in UFO sightings, and the Domings case became too significant to ignore. Reyes began to seriously consider the possibility that the mutilations were being carried out by extraterrestrial entities covertly surveilling the region in ships, using surgical technology advanced far beyond human capabilities. Their cloaking ability would allow them to abduct targets and operate undetected, while harvesting specific organs and tissues from animals and humans for unknown alien purposes. Reyes understood he was pursuing an unconventional lead by legitimately investigating potential extraterrestrial involvement. But if advanced alien species had infiltrated Brazil's sovereignty, their obvious organ and tissue harvesting interest needed urgent scrutiny, especially if they posed a serious threat. Acting on his theory, Reyes traveled undercover to Domings's remote home village, hoping first-hand eyewitness accounts could provide insights on UFO activity or other paranormal events around the era of his disturbing slaying. Reyes felt close to unraveling the truth about the Domings case, that the first documented extraterrestrial infiltration and covert experimentation of this region stretched back decades. But he knew he must gather evidence carefully, without attracting the wrong attention from figures desiring these dark secrets remain buried. Arriving into town, Reyes first stopped to casually question local merchants and farmers about their recollections. Most claimed no memory of strange events around the time frame of Pablo's murder. But their body language betrayed obvious discomfort at his questions. At the cantina one night, Reyes decided it was time to cut directly to the chase. Calling the bartender Ricardo over discreetly, he dropped his voice to a low whisper. "I'll get right to it. I'm investigating Pablo's case, and I have reason to believe unusual forces may have been involved," Reyes said pointedly, raising an eyebrow. "Have you or others here witnessed anything odd around the times of the mutilations?" Ricardo's eyes went wide, and he glanced around nervously. "Best not to speak of such matters for your own good," he muttered. Now I must ask you to leave." Reyes tried approaching a group of elders behind the cantina after hours, hoping liquor had loosened their tongues. But they quickly dispersed, muttering about ignorance being bliss when dealing with the devil's work. These reactions only strengthened Reyes' hunch that the villagers possessed first-hand experiences with paranormal activity around the time of Pablo's slaying that they were forbidden from disclosing. But he would not give up so easily. The truth was here. He just had to find the right informant. That night, Reyes noticed an open bedroom window at the far end of the village. Approaching stealthily, he observed a teenage girl reading by candlelight. Making a quick decision, Reyes tossed a pebble against the glass to get her attention. Startled, the girl opened the window. Reyes stepped forward so she could see him clearly. "I apologize for the intrusion," he said gently. "But I must ask you, have you or your family seen strange lights in the sky around here?" The girl glanced back nervously before replying. "My parents forbid me from speaking of it, but many times even recently," she admitted cryptically. Reyes pressed further, aware he was running out of time. "Please, I know many are scared to talk, but there are lives at stake," he implored. "What can you tell me about those lights?" The girl hesitated, conflicted. Finally, she leaned out and whispered hastily, "They took my aunt after the green lights appeared, and others too, that's all I know." Before Reyes could respond, the girl's parents appeared yelling and pulled her back inside, glancing around in fright. Reyes had no choice but to slip back into the night, mind racing with more questions than answers. But the frightened girl's confession had clearly implicated the lights and subsequent abductions in the killings. He was getting close to the truth, no matter what opposition stood in his way. Chapter 8. Arriving in the remote village where Pablo Dominguez's mutilated body had been discarded in 1980, Detective Reyes immediately felt enveloped by the sleepy rural stillness so different from bustling city life. As he drove past modest family farms, humble adobe homes, and grazing pastures, a pastoral quiet permeated the countryside, broken only by the occasional bleat of a goat or whinny of a horse echoing faintly through the rolling green hills. Pulling up to the single-story brick police station on the village outskirts, Reyes mentally prepared for the wariness he might face questioning these tight-knit townsfolk unaccustomed to city scrutiny. Inside, aging Police Chief Molina unfurled area maps to help Reyes pinpoint the exact site where Dominguez's ravaged body had been found decades prior near a small reservoir on the outskirts. Studying the detailed map, Reyes pondered what sinister force could have transported the mutilated victim so far to dump the body in such a deeply secluded spot, seemingly hoped to conceal their horrific crime for eternity. When Reyes respectfully asked the chief for help tracking down Francisco Santos, the farm boy who had discovered the corpse back in 1980 at just 10 years old, Molina nodded knowingly, familiar with every family in town. He agreed to discreetly reach out to Francisco and help arrange an initial interview. A background check revealed Francisco, likely now in his mid-30s, still lived on a modest farm near the village with his wife and children. When Reyes pulled up the next day, he found Francisco repairing a damaged goat enclosure out front, looking very much the hard-working farmer. Reyes sensed Francisco's guardedness toward this unfamiliar outsider and approached cautiously. Once seated across from each other in the simple kitchen over coffee, Reyes gradually explained his confidential purpose for being there. With patient coaxing, he eased Francisco into slowly recalling buried details surrounding that childhood trauma which had so profoundly shaped him. Francisco's wife Carla sat nearby clasping her husband's hand in support. As Francisco opened up, Reyes extracted forgotten sensory fragments using careful prompting. Francisco recalled a strange flickering light through the trees near the reservoir 2 nights before finding Pablo's body, assuming it was just heat lightning at the time. Reyes leaned in with great interest at this potential lead. Could that light have been an extraterrestrial craft subtly monitoring the area prior to the body dump? What exactly had drawn them to that location? Through further gentle questioning, Reyes also learned Francisco's family had lost 2 goats that same week, one found mutilated with odd surgical incisions, the other simply vanished without a trace. Reyes felt a chill, realizing the timing aligned too closely with his theories about tissue harvesting. The next day, Reyes finally persuaded a very reluctant Francisco to join him in revisiting the reservoir, so he could retrace those traumatic childhood footsteps and shakes loose any latent memories. Francisco hesitated at first, not wanting to reopen old wounds. But his wife Carla firmly urged him to push past the discomfort and help find justice for Pablo if he could. Hiking to the reservoir, Francisco mentally recreated the sequence of events from that awful day. Though the gruesome sights were now faded relics, actually standing at that exact spot triggered an unexpected flood of vivid emotions in Francisco, even after all these years. Reyes scoured the area thoroughly for any lingering clues, but unsurprisingly found nothing of apparent usefulness after so long. As they slowly hiked back, Francisco suddenly halted, pointing excitedly at a massive twisting oak tree. "I remember that old oak," he exclaimed. Reyes rushed over and immediately spotted a faintly carved triangular symbol in the bark about 4 feet up. Though partially obscured by years of accumulated growth, Francisco recalled first seeing the unique shape back, then freshly etched as he had fled the area. Reyes carefully photographed the symbol from all angles, exhilarated by this overlooked physical evidence that could prove the forensic breakthrough he needed. Together, he and Francisco walked slowly back to the village, sharing a renewed sense of hope that the broader truth might still fully emerge into the light, even after lingering for so long in the shadows. Over the next 2 weeks, Reyes became a familiar face around the village as he patiently worked to gain the trust of residents and coax out eyewitness accounts related to his investigation. Most feigned ignorance at first, but Reyes' empathy and discretion eventually persuaded a handful to gradually open up behind closed doors about what they had witnessed during that ominous era. Their chilling stories referenced flickering lights descending silently over the fields at night, leaving scorched circular patches on the ground. Farmers nervously described livestock disappearing without a trace or later being discovered mutilated with inexplicable surgical wounds. And a few of the most rattled elders even whispered of missing villagers after nights filled with strange glowing lights in the sky. Reyes quietly absorbed their fragmented tales without judgment, piecing together a disturbing timeline of escalating extraterrestrial activity and animal experimentation, leading up to Pablo's abduction and savage organ removal procedures prior to his corpse disposal in the reservoir. Late one evening at the cantina, after plying a normally stoic farmer named Ernesto with several strong caipirinhas, Reyes finally managed to extract the most lucid eyewitness account yet. As Ernesto drank, his tongue loosened. "The night Pablo disappeared, many of us saw them take him," Ernesto murmured, glancing around nervously. "That awful disc-shaped craft hovered over the reservoir, then vanished, along with Pablo." Reyes leaned in intently, keeping his voice low. "You're certain it was the same night Pablo went missing?" he asked. Ernesto nodded solemnly. "His mutilated body turned up in that cursed water 2 days later," the farmer whispered with a shudder. "My poor cousin was never the same again after the orange lights took her too, but we dared not speak of it publicly." Reyes' pulse quickened, but he maintained an even tone. "Your secrets are safe with me," he assured the man gently. Tell me, have you seen the craft or lights yourself since that night? Ernesto shook his head. But others still occasionally whisper strange happenings out near the reservoir when the sky glows at night. You tread dangerously by pressing on this, my friend. For your own sake, some truths are best left buried. With that ominous warning, the farmer stood abruptly and tossed some bills on the counter before hurrying out into the darkness. Reyes sat processing the revealing yet cryptic exchange, blood buzzing with building adrenaline, over finally obtaining a definitive eyewitness account directly linking the UFO sightings to Pablo's abduction and mutilation. Reyes spent the next several days discreetly showing the carved tree symbol around town, but no villagers seemed to recognize its meaning. He also hit dead ends trying to identify what powerful group had enforced such pervasive secrecy for decades through means most dared not speak of. Yet Reyes remained undeterred, convinced all the fragments of the truth were now in his grasp. He simply needed to properly assemble the scattered pieces to reconstruct the chilling chain of events, and hopefully still find living witnesses with the courage to publicly corroborate Ernesto's account. Reyes refused to leave until the full story was exposed, bringing a semblance of justice and closure. Under the darkness of a new moon just 1 week later, Reyes witnessed firsthand the very bizarre aerial lights described by the frightened villagers. From a hidden vantage point near the reservoir, he watched in awe as a bulbous disc-shaped craft materialized soundlessly overhead, circled by slowly pulsating orbs of orange light. The unbelievable sight left no doubt in Reyes' mind that an advanced extraterrestrial force had been secretly monitoring this area for decades, abducting locals for experimentation according to their enigmatic agenda. Reyes could barely sleep that night, almost giddy from the weighty implications of what he had seen with his own eyes. No one could refute or rationalize away visual confirmation that interplanetary visitors had infiltrated this remote region of Brazil since at least the 1980s. Hard evidence had been gathered methodically. Now Reyes had to safely deliver the galvanizing truth to the wider world, come what may. Justice waited for brave souls to defy convention and belief, and Reyes knew better than most that unconventional problems sometimes demanded unconventional solutions. Chapter 9. Back in his sparse motel room that night, Reyes scrutinized close-up photos of the triangular symbol carved into the aged tree near the reservoir. He zoomed in tight, enhancing the contrast to bring the intricate engraving into sharper focus against the weathered bark. The evenly spaced lines and precise geometry eliminated any chance this was a random scratching. This was a deliberate, rather intricate carving by intelligent hands. After exhaustive image searches, Reyes confirmed the unique triangle matched known alphabetic characters, cultural markings, arcane runes, or apotropaic wards from any cataloged human civilization or occult tradition, either modern or historical. It appeared completely original and enigmatic. Reyes' sharp mind raced through theories about the symbol's meaning and origins. A numeric territorial marker devised by a serial killer, a coded cartographical coordinate used by smugglers, an obscure sigil linked to a little-known occult group, or some unearthly calling card left by the extraterrestrial entities themselves for reasons beyond human comprehension. The next morning, Reyes interviewed elderly livestock farmers on the village outskirts about any unusual animal deaths or mutilations decades ago when Pablo's body was dumped. One deeply wrinkled cattle farmer named Eduardo immediately recalled losing 2 calves under strange circumstances back in 1980, the same year as Pablo's slaying. The local vet had dismissed their surgical-like wounds as heart attacks, but Eduardo now confirmed both had suffered odd circular tissue extractions. I knew deep down something unnatural happened to those calves, but no one took me seriously back then, remarked Eduardo, visibly relieved someone was finally documenting his story. At another homestead, a horse rancher described being awoken by an eerie, pulsating orange orb hovering over his pasture for minutes in 1981, before speeding away impossibly fast. 2 days later, his prize bull had turned up dead outside the pasture gates, with bizarrely clean surgical incisions and organ removal. The uneasy man crossed himself, muttering about Los Diablos, the devils plaguing their rural communities. Reyes gently steered him towards concrete observations rather than frightening folklore. In the following days, Reyes collected the farmer's old livestock autopsy records from that era, corroborating a disturbing pattern of surgical animal mutilations, with specific organ removal matching Pablo's later human autopsy. Clearly something, human or otherwise, had been methodically harvesting select organs using medically advanced surgical methods before wiping away evidence. After copying their anatomical diagrams and notes as case evidence, Reyes next visited the town's elderly historian, Dona Elena, hoping her knowledge could help decipher the mysterious triangular symbol. The unusual shape proved just as perplexing to Dona Elena as everyone else upon examination. However, over tea, she did share extensive local folklore referencing a long history of unexplained aerial phenomena, with waves of increased sightings in the 1980s-90s, including the famous night of the UFOs flap in 1992. Dona Elena eagerly provided newspaper clippings she had dutifully saved documenting decades of localized UFO accounts alongside speculative occult explanations. Reyes pored over her materials, making copies. By now, Reyes felt analytically certain one or more advanced extraterrestrial intelligences were behind the utterly inexplicable surgical mutilations and local sightings, using elusive ships and cloaking technology to escape detection. But he needed more eyewitnesses and physical evidence to irrefutably expose the truth and confront the authorities suppressing it. Dona Elena mentioned some living locals with first-hand 1980s UFO experiences, sparking an idea in Reyes. He discreetly tracked down Jose, an eccentric villager who had unsuccessfully reported multiple daylight UFO encounters back then. Dismissed as a fabulist by small-minded authorities, Reyes realized Jose likely held valuable eyewitness puzzle pieces. When Reyes arrived unannounced at Jose's remote ramshackle home, the gregarious older man eagerly welcomed him inside to share a lifetime of research and experiences with flashing multicolored nocturnal lights and metallic saucer-shaped craft capable of impossible maneuvers. Jose showed grainy photographs, drawings, video recordings, and mutilated cattle evidence from his own ranch. Reyes took it all in with an open mind, realizing Jose's accounts closely mirrored patterns in the mutilation files and declassified reports. Jose may have been ridiculed by local police, but his testimony proved crucial validating proof of UFO activity in the precise area and timeframes as the surgical mutilations. Before leaving, Reyes helped Jose document every experience in a signed affidavit to make his truth legal record. Reyes felt he was tightening the noose around the long-suppressed secrets. But he still needed the original lost autopsy files to cement an irrefutable connection. In the meantime, Reyes arranged with the rural police chief to have any fresh livestock mutilations or UFO sightings immediately reported to him for on-site forensic investigation. He understood he was now deeply committed to unraveling the village's intertwined mysteries once and for all, even if it meant putting his career and life at risk confronting the powerful forces intent on burying the secrets. As Reyes drove his dusty car slowly back to the village that evening, his mind swirling with revelations, a faint glow through the trees suddenly caught his eye. He pulled over and stepped out, peering into the dark forest. There, hovering over a misty clearing, was a luminous orange orb pulsing mysteriously. Reyes' breath caught in his throat. It was one of the very anomalous lights described repeatedly by eyewitnesses. Reyes grabbed his camera and cautiously moved closer, circling wide to avoid detection. Finding a discreet vantage point behind a tree, he peered around and managed to photograph the orb hovering and pulsating for several minutes before it blinked out and vanished right before his eyes. Rushing to the clearing center, Reyes found only a vaguely circular scorched patch in the grass. Back at his motel, Reyes scrutinized his photos, verifying he had managed to document clear, unambiguous evidence of one of the elusive UFOs described during the 80s flap. The implications left him almost giddy. This visual proof directly connected the lights with the timeline of the surgical mutilations. One more nail in the coffin for those trying desperately to bury the galvanizing truth. Over the next week, Reyes worked tirelessly interviewing every remaining local he could who might have useful memories or experiences related to the bizarre events around 1980. Most provided only hazy recollections at first prodding. But he eventually identified and focused on befriending the tavern owners and bartenders who had served as confessors and hub spots for gossip during that tense era. Nursing drinks at the corner table of the dimly lit village cantina late one night, Reyes finally managed through strategic bonding to gain the confidence of the elderly owner, Miguel. As Miguel drank, he grew reflective. "Many strange things happened back in those days that we dared not speak of publicly," Miguel revealed somberly. "Those lights in the sky, animals found cut up and emptied, good folks gone missing." He crossed himself before continuing. "And the outsiders started coming around more, asking questions, spreading fear." Miguel shook his head. "I don't know what evil invaded our home back then, but I've tried to forget such darkness." Reyes chose his next words carefully. "For those taken, we must find the truth," he implored. "Please, if you know anything more that could explain those events, you must tell me, Miguel." The old barman hesitated, then replied under his breath. "Some nights when the drink flowed, the men would speak of rituals, of inviting wrath from above into our midst, but the Father protects devoted souls." Miguel would say no more, signaling the conversation was over. Reyes sat back mulling over those cryptic yet illuminating fragments, the timeline coalescing in his mind. Whatever sinister beliefs had shadowed this village in 1980, unleashed evil masquerading as power from above, and somehow it had all culminated in the abduction and surgical mutilation of poor Pablo Domínguez before dumping his discarded remains. Outside the dark cantina, Reyes gazed up at the night sky swirling with stars, imagining the blazing lights that had once filled it here. He may still lack the original autopsy files definitively proving extraterrestrial involvement, but Reyes now grasped the deeper human darkness that had surely played a role by inviting the forces in. And he understood that fighting such primal evil required unconventional means of seeking justice. Chapter 10. Reyes inhaled deeply, taking in the earthy scent of freshly brewed coffee as he reviewed the notes spread across his cramped kitchen table. Faded newspaper clippings chronicled grisly cattle mutilations interspersed with eerie UFO sightings. Handwritten witness statements described disturbing close encounters and otherworldly technology. It was a collage of the bizarre, depicting impossible events that defied all logic and scientific explanation. And at the center of the unnerving phenomenon was the horrific 1980 mutilation and murder of Pablo Domínguez, whose mangled remains were found in a remote field displaying the same inexplicable surgical incisions inflicted upon the animals. Reyes was utterly convinced the causes were connected, but the authorities had buried the full truth for decades, denying any link between the strange UFO activity and the vicious death. Reyes lifted the chipped mug to his lips, the hot liquid providing fleeting comfort against the growing chill of the drafty kitchen. He had devoted half his life to solving what powerful figures wished to keep suppressed, risking his reputation and more in the pursuit of answers. There were mornings when the obstacles felt too immense, the cover-up too deep, but Reyes could never turn away. Not when the tormented dead still cried out for justice. Leaning back, Reyes closed his eyes and let his mind drift back to where it had all started 30 years ago, the remote village where he had grown up in the shadow of strange lights in the sky. His boyhood memories were filled with tales of bizarre nocturnal experiments visited upon animals in the night. Villagers would discover livestock slaughtered in pastures, cut with meticulous precision, and organs mysteriously extracted. The elders whispered nervously of wrathful gods, but others glimpsed peculiar lights preceding the horrors. Young Reyes himself had spotted the glowing red saucers hovering in the distance late one evening while walking home from the fields. But when he told his parents, they dismissed it as a figment of his imagination. In daylight, the fantastic seemed impossible. Only with the shocking murder of Pablo Domínguez did the phantoms of the night emerge fully into the stark light of reason. Reyes shuddered as Domínguez's ravaged remains flooded his mind. The missing eyes, organs scooped clean from the torso, patterns of burns searing the flesh. Exactly like the lifeless animals found across the countryside, only horrifyingly visited upon a man. The authorities moved quickly to silence all talk, urging villagers to forget what they had seen. But Reyes was transfixed, needing to understand forces beyond comprehension. He pored through stray newspaper reports, eavesdropped around campfires, clinging to any threads that might explain the unfathomable. Decades later, Reyes' search for answers had led him far across Brazil, driven by obsession deeper than reason. His superiors in the Federal Investigative Bureau tolerated his die-hard, mystifying quest, humoring the aging man they deemed chasing phantoms. Just wrap it up soon, they urged, but Reyes inwardly scoffed. The bureaucrats knew nothing of the churning abyss into which he daily stared. Returning to the present moment, Reyes lifted his coffee mug only to find it empty. He slowly rose to rinse it in the sink, joints creaking. Dawn would break soon, starting the next fruitless day trudging the countryside searching for witnesses who no longer existed. But Reyes had vowed long ago to follow this twisted trail wherever it led, even if it meant only gathering faded echoes decades later. Stepping outside into the cool morning mist, Reyes surveyed the remote rural landscape that had birthed this mystery. Dew glistened on gnarled oaks and scrub brush quilting the rolling hills. What clues might their roots still cradle? Reyes breathed deeply, finding fleeting serenity in the muffled solitude. Some days this land felt cursed, but it remained home. Settling into his battered Jeep, Reyes turned the ignition only to be greeted with an ominous sputter. "Not now, old friend," he whispered, patting the worn steering wheel. After a few more cranks, the engine roared stubbornly to life. Reyes patted his shirt pocket, holding the list of names and villages yet to visit. So many cold leads, but he had to believe answers were out there if he asked the right questions. Winding through forgotten rural lanes, Reyes eventually arrived at a ramshackle farmhouse, its weathered siding nearly swallowed up by encroaching weeds and vines. Glancing at his list, he confirmed the name Javier Hernandez, one of the last remaining elders who might recall the bizarre 1980 events. The man had been just a teenager then, but you never knew what might trigger a lost memory. Reyes stepped onto the sagging porch, rehearsing his usual gentle questions. A wizened old face peered out through the screen door, eyeing Reyes up and down silently before pushing it open. "You looking for me?" the man finally rasped. Reyes nodded, removing his hat respectfully. "Javier Hernandez, I'm Investigator Reyes, hoping to ask you some questions about things you may remember from around 1980, when you would have been a young man." The old man's rheumy eyes narrowed, deep creases lining his leathery brown face. "Not sure I can remember much from way back then, some." Reyes pressed gently. Anything at all about some strange events, mysterious animal deaths, odd lights people talked about. Hernandez turned away abruptly. "Don't know what you're talking about. Best you look elsewhere." Before Reyes could respond, the door clicked shut, screen swaying. Another dead end, but he'd long grown accustomed to them. Reyes sighed and turned to leave. Glancing back, he thought he spotted the curtain sway as if someone had been watching him depart. Perhaps a fragment of memory yet lingered. But for now, the door remained closed. Over the next week, Reyes doggedly navigated the back roads, visiting name after name on his rapidly dwindling list. Most who answered either claimed total ignorance or quickly shut him down. Never easy prying into past darkness people wanted left buried. But Reyes had to keep trying. Late one afternoon, an unexpected phone tip came from a shopkeeper claiming an elderly woman, Avelina Cortez, had spoken of experiencing a shocking UFO encounter on a rural road in 1980, followed by her cow being mutilated. Reyes nearly dropped the phone in excitement. This sounded like exactly the sort of eyewitness account he desperately needed, a direct connection linking UFO presence to the animal mutilations and quite possibly Pablo's murder. Tracking down the woman's remote address, Reyes sped urgently along the winding roads as shadows stretched over the countryside. Pulling up outside a decaying cottage choked in weeds and vines, he stepped hesitantly onto the creaking porch. Curtains hung partially open in the front window, but no lights shone inside. "This is Cortez," Reyes called softly, rapping his knuckles on the weathered wood door. "My name is Reyes. I just have some questions about local history." He heard shuffling movement inside, then the door edged open, chain lock still fastened. One roomy eye peered out as Reyes tried to seem as non-threatening as possible. "What do you want? Never seen you before," a wavering voice demanded. Reyes removed his hat respectfully. "Please, I only need a moment of your time. Ma'am, I was told you might remember a strange event from 1980 involving bright lights in the sky." Reyes held his breath hopefully. Several endless seconds passed before the eye looking him up and down blinked slowly. "Wait there," the voice replied before the door closed again. Reyes heard the chain slide free, then the knob turned once more. He exhaled as an elderly woman gazed up at him on the threshold, hair wispy white and frame bent with age but eyes still alert. "Best come in then and let's get this over with," she said brusquely, standing aside for Reyes to enter the dimly lit cottage. He quickly wiped his feet and removed his hat, grateful for the chance to talk. Settling stiffly into a dusty armchair, the woman studied Reyes intently. "So you want to know about the lights and such from way back? Most folk pretend it never happened." Reyes nodded eagerly, leaning forward. "Yes, ma'am. Anything at all you recall. I know it was long ago, but even fragments can help me understand." The woman's eyes took on a distant look as she gazed beyond Reyes into the hazy past. "Never told barely a soul once it happened. Knew they'd think me crazy or lying. But I got nothing left to lose in my old age, so I'll tell you what I saw." According to Avelina Cortez, in 1980, soon after her husband died, leaving her a young widow, she had taken to traveling alone to the markets to sell crops from her little farmstead. One evening, returning just before dusk along an isolated rural route, Her pickup truck's engine abruptly sputtered and died. As she pumped the gas pedal in vain, an eerie glow appeared, bathing the cab in brilliant orange light. Heart pounding, she gazed up to see an oval orange craft the size of her barn silently hovering no more than 30 feet overhead, so low she could have hit it with a rock. "I was paralyzed, couldn't even think to move or scream," Adelina whispered. It had strange glowing symbols around the middle, and the light was so bright it almost burnt my eyes, but I couldn't look away. As she sat frozen in terror, a pale blue beam slowly extended from the belly of the craft, methodically scanning over her and the old Ford pickup for several minutes. The truck's radio emitted piercing static, lights flickering erratically. Then, just as silently as it appeared, the blinding craft vanished upward into the darkening sky faster than her eyes could follow. Adelina found herself able to move again, heart still hammering. After catching her breath, she was astonished when the truck's engine turned over on the first try. Still in shock, she drove the rest of the way home on autopilot, praying she wouldn't encounter the anomalous craft again. Reyes could hardly contain his eagerness hearing the account firsthand, just as reported. This was his most compelling UFO eyewitness yet, still razor-sharp so many decades later. "Mrs. Cortez, would you feel comfortable signing a statement outlining what you witnessed? It would be of immense help documenting these significant events," Reyes gently asked. A shadow crossed Adelina's face at the request. "I tried to put all that out of mind after it happened. Never wanted to dwell on it or have others poking around." She looked down at her weathered hands, gnarled with age. "But I ain't got much time left, and there's strange things beyond understanding in this world. So if it helps bring some peace to others, I'll sign whatever you need." Reyes could barely contain his profound gratitude. This courageous woman was handing him the linchpin tying everything together at long last. He urgently explained how her experiences aligned perfectly with other accounts and evidence. Adelina listened intently, resolve growing on her wrinkled face. "Always knew in my gut what I saw was real, and that it took my favorite milk cow afterward," she said. "Just give me the papers, son. Past time the truth came out." After Adelina carefully penned her signature on the detailed statement, Reyes clutched the precious pages, promising to guard them with his life. Suddenly, the moment felt heavy, like a curtain had been pulled back to reveal shadowy forces lurking at the boundaries of understanding. Reyes lingered a while longer, ensuring Adelina felt safe. But her steadfast eyes reassured him she had made peace with whatever might come. Departing the isolated cottage as darkness fell, Reyes was fired with new momentum. With this direct eyewitness account, the links could no longer be denied. The implications were explosive. He sped urgently toward home, mind racing with what had to be done next. Glancing at the priceless signed statement on the seat beside him, Reyes knew unstoppable momentum was gathering. The time had finally come to drag the buried past screaming into the light. But several miles down the road, Reyes was jolted from his thoughts by the sudden blaring ring of his cell phone. Heart lurching, he saw Adelina's name on the screen and quickly answered. The elderly woman sounded distressed, saying she was convinced strange lights were outside her home and heard frightening noises around the property after he had left. Fearing the entities behind the decades of horror had come for Adelina to permanently silence her, Reyes shouted he was on his way and slammed the gas pedal. Tires spitting gravel, he tore back along the rural lanes with rising dread. What if he was already too late? Barreling up to the dark cottage 15 minutes later, Reyes leapt from his still-moving jeep, eyes desperately scanning for movement. Rushing onto the porch, he spotted what looked like an oval orange light rapidly lifting into the night sky over the barn before disappearing as Adelina had described. Heart in his throat, Reyes threw open the door, calling Adelina's name. In the front sitting room, she emerged shaken but unharmed from where she had been peering out the curtains. Reyes helped her into a chair, looking her over for any signs of harm. "I'm all right, son. They just tried to scare me is all. Make me take back what I saw," she said firmly, patting Reyes' hand. "But it'll take more than lights in the sky to make me forget the truth." Reyes felt immense relief she was uninjured, but cold anger settled in his gut. These forces had already taken too much from innocent people. It had to end. Kneeling before her, Reyes grasped Adelina's hands tightly. "I swear to you that sharing what you witnessed will lead to revelation of what really happened here all those years ago. The dead deserve justice." She smiled sadly, eyes distant again. "I hope so, son. I surely hope so." Reyes embraced her frail shoulders, whispering thanks into her snowy hair before departing into the night, breath fogging in the cold air. Climbing into his jeep, he glimpsed the sign statement still lying undisturbed on the passenger seat. Its power seemed to radiate outward like a damning beacon shining light into the abyss. Gripping the wheel with white knuckles, Reyes started the engine, which roared to life with uncommon fury. As he navigated the winding lane back home, his mind turned to the next phase, gaining access to the original sealed mutilation files that the authorities had buried for decades while dismissing links to the UFO sightings as mass hysteria. The cover-up had woven elaborate layers, but Reyes was confident that with Adelina's testimony now officially documented, the unraveling was unstoppable. The shameful facts had lurked in the darkness for too long already. He had sworn not to stop until the veil was torn aside. Reyes arrived home close to midnight, body utterly spent, but spirit on fire. The night's events seemed unreal, like a dream long awaited. Yet the signed statement sat tangibly on his table, illuminated in a splash of moonlight. Adelina's courage stirred Reyes profoundly. If this humble woman could face the sinister unknown with such conviction, after decades of silence, how could he falter from carrying forth her gift of truth? Exhaustion could wait. There was urgent work to be done. Sitting alone at the kitchen table as dawn's first glow filtered in, Reyes wrote page after page strategizing his next moves. He listed names of police clerks and record staff who might be persuaded to covertly help access the buried files in exchange for a cut of the certain lucrative media rights from exposing the unprecedented hidden documents. Bribery left a sour taste, but extraordinary times called for extraordinary measures. This was now a war to bring dark deeds to light. By the time Reyes had filled several pages with potential informants to discreetly recruit, he could barely hold his pencil upright. His bleary eyes took in the hazy rectangle of morning sunlight framing the table. Somehow hours had slipped by in feverish planning, but there was no time to rest. Rising slowly on creaking joints, Reyes drained the last cold dregs from the coffee pot before slipping on his coat and hat. The next phase was risky, but finding an inside ally with access was the only way to obtain the buried autopsy reports and evidence. Reyes' decades of obsession had all built inexorably toward this approaching reckoning. There could be no hesitation, only action. Stepping outside into the brisk dawn air helped revive his energy and focus. Reyes took a deep breath, gazing across the rural expanse just awakening today. Somewhere out there, the clues to unraveling the dark heart of this mystery still waited to be found. It was time to gather them, regardless of what forces stood in his way. Chapter 11. The thin mountain air chilled Reyes to the bone as he stepped out of his rented jeep and stood taking in the craggy majesty surrounding the remote village. After traversing 3 hours of potholed dirt roads to reach the far-flung spot on the old hand-drawn map, the sheer isolation here felt palpable. With dogged determination fueling his steps, Reyes hefted his scuffed leather briefcase and approached the cluster of ramshackle huts scattered along the edge of the steep gorge. He was searching for one hut in particular, and the peeling paint on its warped wooden door bore the address he sought. An elderly woman answered Reyes' sharp rap on the weathered door, eyeing the unfamiliar visitor warily. Her deep wrinkles and traditional hand-woven garments signaling she was likely a descendant of the indigenous tribes who had dwelt in these mountains long before colonizers ever stepped foot on these lands. With polite greetings in her native language, Reyes introduced himself simply as an investigator from the capital seeking any information she might have on unusual events that may have occurred years ago in these parts. Though clearly puzzled by the vague inquiries, the kindness in the woman's dark eyes beckoned him inside. Over sweetened cups of tea, Adelina Cortez slowly opened up about being one of the only remaining witnesses to strange phenomena the villagers had experienced decades ago, but long since learned to never speak of again for self-preservation. With gentle coaxing, the elderly woman gradually disclosed whispered stories passed down about bright lights often streaking the night skies above the mountains. And on rare occasions, brief glimpses of bizarre circular crafts, unlike any planes landing silently in the remote highland valleys. Most chilling were hushed tales of finding mutilated carcasses of livestock with strange surgical wounds after nights of unexplained roaring skylights. The villagers avoided the ominous gorge after sundown, crosses and amulets their only defense against forces beyond understanding. Reyes leaned forward intently, scribbling notes. Confirming similar frightened testimonies he had painstakingly collected over the past year from indigenous peoples across this vast country, attempting in vain to report their experiences to baffled or dismissive authorities. Each account on its own seeming the isolated ravings of poor superstitious minds. But woven together, Reyes now realized, they painted an increasingly compelling tapestry of a widespread phenomenon long suppressed. The aging woman's eyes misted with remembered fear as she confessed her long-buried secret. Just before fleeing the remote village for good as a young mother decades ago, she too had a chilling encounter. Awakened before dawn by a vibrating hum resonating through her hut's thin walls, Adelina crept outside to investigate. Peering up past the edge of the gorge, she witnessed blood-curdling sights no amount of blessing herself could erase from memory. A glowing disc-like craft, dwarfing any earthly plane, hovered silently above the far valley. Beams of garish light radiated down from the smooth underside of the mammoth vessel, scanning the rocky terrain methodically. Near the craft, she could just make out several small, frail figures clad in tight silvery suits, moving slowly among the brush in a line. Though at a great distance, looking at their bulbous heads and spindly limbs made the young Adelina nauseous with primal dread. Before the petrified woman could observe more, the vessel blinked out its intense lights and ascended rapidly into the night sky, shrinking from view. Adelina knew then it was time to flee the only home her family had ever known, leaving behind the cursed mountains and whatever malevolent forces dwelled among them. Before the elderly woman could recount more, she was racked by a fit of coughing. Reyes helped ease her frail frame into bed, promising to keep her identity confidential, but profoundly grateful for her courage to finally reveal long-hidden truths. As Reyes descended from the perilous mountain roads back towards Brasilia, his car swerving along cliffside switchbacks in the fading light, he felt energized by the critical progress of his covert investigation. Despite hitting walls of denial and ridicule when pressing authorities for answers, He realized more than ever he was on the cusp of exposing a monumental cover-up. Arriving home at the city limits as darkness enveloped the landscape, Reyes' radio crackled to life mid-song with an emergency dispatch announcement. A ranch hand reporting his entire herd of cattle, over 40 heads, found gruesomely mutilated and exsanguinated overnight. Throats slit with laser precision. Body parts carefully removed and laid out. Blood drained from the pasture soil. Reyes gripped his steering wheel with white knuckles. It was the same remote ranch where he had gotten an anonymous ranch hand to timidly confide seeing unnatural lights hovering over the fields at night. But out of paralyzing fear of losing his job and reputation, the man refused any signed statement. Reyes knew time was running short. Whatever sinister forces were at work, their experiments were escalating. He had to act swiftly before the thin trail of clues dried up for good, or informants met similar fates as the lifeless cattle. Justice needed to be served for ignored rural communities long suffering this secret horror, and urgent scientific revelations needed to come to light after being buried for too long. Armed at last with several signed eyewitness testimonies and his extensive research dossier of connecting evidence, Reyes promptly returned from the remote village back to Brasilia. He immediately set up a face-to-face meeting with the Attorney General and his aides to directly present his explosive findings. But after being suspiciously stonewalled for days regarding the urgent meeting request, Reyes finally received an odd, cryptically worded phone call instructing him to report to a nondescript government building downtown the next morning, where an unmarked car would be waiting curbside to transport him securely to a classified location. Reyes arrived cautiously early at the rendezvous point the next day with all his meticulously compiled case files in hand. He paced the downtown sidewalk, warily scanning the busy street for his announced mystery vehicle. Right on time, a nondescript black sedan with heavily tinted windows soon pulled up silently before him. As Reyes cautiously reached for the back door handle, he heard the locks click open automatically as if beckoning him inside. Feeling increasingly uneasy about the peculiar cloak and dagger proceedings, but seeing little choice, Reyes reluctantly slid into the back leather seat, carefully placing his briefcase full of documents atop his lap. As the unmarked sedan drove steadily out of the crowded city, Reyes quickly realized they were not actually heading to the state attorney general's office downtown, as he had been firmly expecting and instructed. Growing increasingly uneasy, he politely but firmly asked the driver to confirm their final destination, but was met only with stony silence from the stoic man. Attempts to open the rear and front doors proved futile, as all handles were electronically locked. The unnervingly quiet car soon pulled up to a windowless and ominously imposing concrete structure hidden deep in the remote outskirts of the city, surrounded by tall chain-link fences, crowned with rolls of razor-sharp barbed wire. Reyes noted the complete lack of any identifying signs, address, or governmental markings on or around the foreboding complex. His investigators' instincts screamed that something was very wrong here. Reyes hesitated nervously before getting out of the car, every sense now on high alert. But with the internal door locks still electronically engaged, he was left with no choice but to reluctantly exit the vehicle as directed. The moment his feet hit the ground, Reyes found himself tightly flanked on both sides by two huge, imposing men dressed in crisp black suits who had been lying in wait for him. They forcibly escorted the anxious detective inside the windowless building without a word exchanged between them. Reyes was led through a disorienting sterile maze of bright white corridors and locked double doors requiring fingerprint access until they finally reached an austere windowless conference room outfitted with banks of advanced computers, encrypted communications gear, and electronic surveillance monitors. A gray-haired, distinguished-looking older man in an immaculate military uniform, covered in medals and ribbons, sat waiting at the far end of the table, his hands neatly steepled in front of him. "Detective Reyes, please sit down. We have much to discuss. Quite frankly, certain high-level people here have grown extremely concerned about these inconvenient notions you seem to have gotten into your head lately. We were hoping you might allow us this opportunity to clarify a few confidential things regarding your unauthorized investigation," the official stated with rehearsed calmness, but Reyes detected thinly veiled menace behind his polite words. The mysterious officer proceeded to methodically lay out that he was well aware of every minute detail of Reyes' independent investigation over the past month, the specific eyewitness testimonies gathered, the veterinary ranch autopsy photos compiled, and even elderly Adelina Cortez's extremely recent close daylight sighting encounter and sworn statement. The man made it unambiguously clear, without any direct threats, that Reyes' lone wolf investigation had now plunged deeply into classified areas far exceeding his lowly security clearance as a mere police detective. However, rest assured that the wider situation you have haphazardly uncovered remains firmly under our control and oversight at the highest spheres of authority, the intimidating officer stated dryly. He emphatically stressed that no public mention should ever be made of outlandish concepts like crashed UFOs, extraterrestrial visitations, or unexplained cattle and human mutilations for the greater good of Brazil. When Reyes fiercely pushed back, refusing to surrender a month's worth of evidence or renege on his sworn duty to expose the full truth that had been buried for decades, the authoritative man across from him sighed with feigned disappointment that more permanent unfortunate measures would now be required to ensure compliance from the headstrong detective for the sake of protecting and pacifying an impressionable wider public. Before Reyes even had a chance to spring from his seat or cry for help, the two hulking suited guards instantly materialized behind him and seized the struggling investigator by both arms in a vice-like grip. He was forcibly dragged from the room, kicking and yelling down several more locked corridors to what appeared to be a medical examination room outfitted with banks of ominous equipment and sterile surgical tools. As Reyes shouted desperate appeals for his basic rights and due process, truly terrified thoughts raced through his mind about what horrific fates these powerful puppet masters might be planning to now silence him forever with, in order to keep their elaborate decades-long extraterrestrial cover-up contained at any cost. Just before the guards roughly threw Reyes' wriggling body down onto the cold metal exam table, he caught a brief petrifying glimpse out of the corner of his eye of a sinister surgical instrument tray stocked with circular saws, lasers, and knives that chillingly echoed the advanced medical devices described in the classified mutilation autopsy reports he had uncovered. As the panicked Reyes screamed in primal fear for his very life, the guards ruthlessly stuffed a ball gag into his mouth and placed a suffocating oxygen mask over his nose and face. The last garbled sounds Reyes heard as he slipped out of frantic consciousness, and the world faded to black, were the frightening whirs of a high-powered bone saw starting up right beside his head, along with the guard's sadistic laughter. Epilogue. In the hazy aftermath of Detective Reyes' sudden ominous disappearance, a thick fog of uncertainty and dread settled over the remote rural communities where scattered reports of disturbing aerial lights and animal mutilations had trickled out over many decades. Among the simple ranchers and farmers who had uneasily coexisted with the bizarre happenings transpiring in the darkness around their isolated homesteads, many now feared the tenacious investigators' forced silence signaled something even more sinister was still lurking out there in the lonely, winding backroads. As for the sprawling halls of power in Brazil's capital, officials moved swiftly behind closed doors to keep the disquieting Vanishing Act shrouded in calculated ambiguity. Through backchannels and bureaucratic sleight of hand, the government falsely reported Reyes had abruptly opted for an early medical retirement from the force, citing only undisclosed health reasons for the extremely irregular timing of his immediate departure right before a major investigative breakthrough. Of course, with the inconvenient agent now conveniently and permanently silenced, before he could blow the lid off decades of deep state secrets, those in the highest positions of authority were eager to promptly rebury the most confounding and volatile mutilation case files and evidence back into Brazil's deepest, most secure confidential archives. Top officials now fervently hoped this ruthless cover-up would finally be the very last time they would be forced to contend with the heat and light generated by those scattered rural claims involving sightings of otherworldly lights in the night sky, surgical animal mutilations, or most alarmingly, chilling rumors surrounding inexplicable medical procedures performed on locals. After all, unchecked civilian speculation and panic over such salacious reports threatened the careful cultivation of placid order and compliance that allowed the gears of power to turn most smoothly. However, just 2 weeks after Reyes' coerced disappearance, a brazen anonymous source directly delivered all of the extensive mutilation case files, raw investigative research materials, and notes the driven detective had tirelessly accumulated over decades to the doorsteps and mailrooms of several major newspapers across Brazil. The explosive leaked package included all of Reyes' assigned internal records, candid eyewitness testimonies, confidential police ranch mutilation autopsy photos, and even the personal journal entries from the missing detective's encrypted diary, which extensively detailed his unconventional theories regarding the potential paranormal and extraterrestrial connections behind the macabre events. The instant this absolute bombshell of leaked documents exploded across front pages, exposing decades of unthinkable government UFO and mutilation cover-ups in meticulous detail, it predictably sparked immediate public outcry and demands for full government accountability over revelations that advanced, likely non-human activities had been occurring apparently unchecked in some of Brazil's most remote regions. Now emboldened by the stark evidence finally laid bare, astute citizens called on officials to fully disclose what had truly happened to the now missing Reyes as he stood on the cusp of his groundbreaking investigation going public. Had the righteous man been permanently silenced by nefarious forces to suppress the disturbing truths he had uncovered in his relentless probing of classified archives? Where was the proof he was even still alive? While establishment government spokespeople moved swiftly to denounce the entire leaked Reyes dossier as hearsay and circumstantial conspiracy nonsense unworthy of serious official inquiry or response, the same courageous Brazilian print journalist who had originally published the initial explosive Doming's mutilation autopsy photos years earlier now ran prominent front-page coverage citing large, verbatim portions of the leaked documents. In his bold reporting, the crusading newspaper editor made a compelling journalistic case to his readers that the extensive eyewitness testimonies and photographic forensic evidence compiled by Reyes before his beyond the suspicious disappearance clearly constituted important proof that something extremely ominous was still transpiring within the darkness of Brazil's power centers, something officials were actively conspiring to cover up and deny even now, decades later. In the dramatic aftermath of this massive journalistic expose that seemed to finally shed direct light on the unthinkable, massive public pressure mounted rapidly for immediate and total government transparency around the bizarre chain of events hinted at in the leaked materials. But military intelligence and law enforcement officials held an uncharacteristically unified front, quickly moving in lockstep to shut down and aggressively discredit renewed mutilation investigations proposed by opposition leaders. Sheltering behind familiar mantras, Authorities staunchly maintained all of Reyes' compiled sources and materials amounted to nothing but delusional myth and hearsay unworthy of serious inquiry or response. Those deeply suspicious of state motives quickly accused Brazil's entrenched institutions of continuing to cover up the ominous fuller reality surrounding the uncanny happenings and forced disappearances. But more skeptical voices in Brazilian media and academia cautiously argued that reasonable conventional explanations could still exist for the bizarre surgical-like mutilation wounds so extensively documented, as well as for the many reports of unusual nocturnal aerial phenomena over decades. These more conservative viewpoints appealed for the public to stay rational and avoid reckless descent into conspiracy thinking. However, among the true believers in Brazil's now substantial extraterrestrial and paranormal research fields, the name of Detective Reyes was already being passionately memorialized and lionized as a righteous martyr for sacrificing everything in his quest to expose difficult suppressed truths about government contacts with advanced non-human intelligences that national security officials had always labored so vigorously to conceal from the people. To his admirers, Reyes was a heroic champion for forcing the first cracks to appear in the government's once impenetrable wall of UFO secrecy and denial. But the ultimate fate of Reyes himself, whether eliminated or simply imprisoned permanently in some deep underground blacksite dungeon, would remain tragically forever uncertain, like so many other baffling, unanswered questions connected to Brazil's decades of strange, unsolved mysteries. For now, with the government's facade of control seemingly intact, the restless public could only continue grasping fitfully in the dark for real answers about what was truly going on in the lonely places where few dared tread, while authorities prayed fervently that the dangerous secrets Reyes had stirred up and nearly exposed would once again gradually fade to legend as time marched forward. Yet creeping beneath the surface, a lingering unease had been awakened within the Brazilian national psyche. For many citizens haunted by the mysteries, a bone-chilling realization had taken root that ominous paranormal forces, perhaps beyond rational human comprehension, were still likely roaming free in the land, periodically emerging from the shadows to prey upon innocents. And the forced permanent silence of Reyes would endure uncomfortably in the nation's consciousness, as a reminder that seeking to directly expose the darkness could carry unfathomable risks. So the cryptic triangular flesh carvings, the scattered animal mutilations, the inexplicably missing organs, and the eerie dancing lights haunting the night sky would remain Brazil's timeless unresolved mysteries, lingering forever in the hazy borderland between mundane fact and unsettling folklore. And on certain silent nights in the rural communities most touched by the strangeness, parents would gently warn their children to keep watch for any unnatural lights in the darkness between the familiar stars, and to run home quickly if anything seemed amiss. For things lurked out there in the shadows that humble ranchers knew to avoid, that indigenous shamans whispered prayers against, and that city officials hoped fervently could be kept suppressed through denial. There were some riddles simply too unsettling for the feeble human mind to ponder for long, unknown forces that dwelled where nightmares began in Brazil's most remote regions. But now the sealed crypt holding those mysteries had been opened, just a crack. And there would be no returning to the bliss of ignorance. The end.